On a hot January day in 1879, a small mission station in southern Africa stood in the path of a storm. Fewer than 160 men, many of them sick or tired, stacked bags of corn and boxes of biscuit into walls. They could hear singing from the hills. They knew a great army was coming. They stayed anyway. This is the story of Rorke's Drift, of fear, grit, and stubborn courage, of men who built a fort from farm supplies and held back waves of warriors through smoke, fire, and the dark. Today, we step into that place and that hour. The Anglo-Zulu War began in January 1879. The British Empire had pushed its borders, and the Zulu kingdom stood in the way. The Zulu were not a rumor or a shadow. They were a proud nation with discipline, speed, and a long tradition of warfare. Their king, Cetshwayo, had not asked for this fight, but when it came, his regiments answered. The British plan looked simple on paper. 3 columns would cross the border, press inward, and force a quick end. The center column, under Lord Chelmsford, crossed the Buffalo River at a shallow spot called Rorke's Drift. On one side of the river lay Natal, on the other Zululand. Rorke's Drift was just a mission station and a supply depot. A small church, a storehouse, a hospital. White walls the color of sun-baked bone. A yard, a few trees. A track running toward the hills. No one there imagined it would become a battlefield, until the same day the British were crushed at a lonely mountain named Isandlwana. The date was January 22nd, 1879. In the afternoon, messengers burst into Rorke's Drift, faces dusted with red earth, eyes wide, words tumbling out. The center column had met the main Zulu army near Isandlwana and lost. Not a minor setback, not a draw, a disaster. Thousands of Zulu warriors had broken a British camp. The road behind Rorke's Drift was open. At the mission, 2 young officers were in charge. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers, a quiet man who'd been building a bridge. Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment, hard of hearing, steady, brave. Around them, about 100 men of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. A handful from other units, some hospital patients on cots, a few civilian personnel, a chaplain, a surgeon. They looked at one another. Run? The thought fell to the ground like a rock. To move patients over rough ground with an army at your back was a plan for death. So they decided they would stand and fight. There were no stone walls, no trenches. So the men made their own fortress. They dragged heavy mealie bags, sacks of maize, and stacked them shoulder high. They piled wooden biscuit boxes to fill gaps. They cut firing holes with bayonets and knives. They linked the storehouse to the hospital with a breastwork. They built a smaller inner wall in case the outer line fell. Acting Assistant Commissary James Dalton, an older man with keen eyes, pointed where the lines should go. Color Sergeant Frank Bourne kept the men in order. Surgeon James Reynolds and his assistants turned corners of the mission into aid posts, laid out bandages, filled basins, boiled lint. Reverend George Smith fetched water and later would carry ammunition in the smoke and heat, passing it down the line with calm hands. They worked as daylight slid down the wall and the shadows lengthened. The sound from the hills rose and fell like waves. You could feel the air tighten. You could see men swallow hard and say nothing. Private Alfred Henry Hook tightened a strap and glanced at the hospital where he would soon fight for his life, in rooms barely wider than a bed. Nearby, Privates John Williams and William Jones checked their rifles and exchanged a small nod that said, "We do our duty." We hold the sun tilted. The land glowed a softer gold. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else cracked a joke too fast and laughed a little too loud. The earth smelled of dust, rope, corn. Then the first Zulu scouts appeared on the hills. They came as dark lines against the light, then broke into the open with speed that startled even men who thought themselves ready. The Zulu regiments moved with purpose. Buffalo horns spread out to encircle, a chest to hit front on, young warriors eager for the first strike. Spears flashed rifles, old muskets and captured guns fired from the rocks. The British held their nerve. They fired by section, cool and methodical. Smoke curled and snapped in the sun. The first rush broke on the mealie bag wall and fell back. Another rush, then another. Bodies gathered in the grass. The ground shook with feet. Cheers rose and were swallowed by new shouts. The air turned hot and tasted of powder. At the southern wall, the pressure was worst. Zulu warriors ran low under the bullets, slammed against the sacks, and stabbed upward through gaps. Bayonets jabbed down. The rhythm was fierce and close. Men shifted, reloaded, fired, passed ammo, wiped sweat with dirty sleeves. Dalton moved along the line, pointing, steadying. Bourne's voice cut clean through fear. Orders short and hard, never wasted. Bromhead stood where men could see him. Chard kept the shape of the fight in his head, where the line bent, where it might break, where to fall back if they had to. This went on for an hour that felt like many. The Zulu were not a wave that hits once and recedes. They were the sea itself. Rush, recoil, gather, rush again. Then the fight poured into the low white building that everyone had dreaded, the hospital. The hospital at Rorke's Drift was more like a row of clay rooms under one roof, linked by doors that didn't all line up. Patients lay in narrow spaces. Windows were small. Smoke had nowhere to go. Zulu warriors reached the building and began to batter the doors. Some fired through windows at faces inside. Others climbed onto the roof and tore at thatch. The rooms filled with sparks. Flames took hold. Inside, Hook, Williams, Jones, and others fought from bed to bed. They smashed through inner walls to open new ways out, hauling weak men over shoulders. In one room, a patient cried out and grabbed a rescuer's sleeve. In another, a stretcher burned, then fell to ash. The men shot at shadows at arm's length and felt the kick of the rifles bruise their shoulders. They swung rifle butts. They shoved burning thatch with their boots. They dashed into smoke, grabbed a patient, and dragged him toward a new hole they had just smashed through with a bayonet. The heat rose like a living thing. The ceiling hissed. Charred flakes fluttered. A beam crashed and showered sparks. A man coughed until he retched and still went back for another patient. Outside, the defenders held a shrinking yard as the hospital glowed orange. The Zulu cheered when the roof fell in. For a moment, between sparks and black smoke, the sky looked like night had come at once. They lost the hospital, but they saved lives one by one. Hook staggered out with a man on his back, turned at the doorway, and fired once more into the smoke. Williams and Jones pulled another patient through a hole barely big enough for two. Surgeon Reynolds, sleeves rolled and face black with soot, took them at the wall, bound wounds, and pushed water on cracked lips. The defenders pulled back toward the inner wall. The yard shrank. The world became biscuit boxes, mealie bags, and the inches in front of your face. Darkness fell. The mission was now a ring of low walls and sharpened senses. The men formed a shorter line inside the larger square. Ammunition was counted out. Reverend Smith moved along the ranks, calm and pale, passing cartridges down with a quick, steady rhythm. Here. And here. And here small words, but they kept hands moving and minds from fear. The Zulu did not vanish in the night. They tested the line again and again, firing from rocks, rushing where the shadows seemed thickest. Sometimes their cries came from one side, then from the other, just to split the defenders' attention. A few slipped close and threw spears in high arcs that thumped into bags and boxes. A spearhead glowed in the firelight like the eye of a cat. Every sound meant something. A rustle, a foot on gravel, a whisper of grass, a click that could be a rifle or a stone. Men learned to read the dark by how it moved. Chard issued short orders. Bromhead shifted groups from one corner to another. Dalton caught a man who was starting to shake and put him in a spot where he could pass ammo, not fire. Bourne marked the time, just enough to know how long they had held. It is one thing to fight for 10 minutes, another to keep your heart steady through hours when your mind says stop, and you must tell it again and again, not yet. They could smell the river, a cool thread in the warm night. They could smell blood and powder and the sweet, bitter scent of burned wood. No one slept. No one thought beyond the next minute. At one point, a rush broke through a corner and spilled into the yard. It became a knot of bodies and bright flashes in the black. A lantern dropped and broke. A man cried out a name and then no sound at all. The knot loosened as the defenders stabbed and fired, then slammed boxes into the gap to close it. Somewhere a man laughed quietly for no reason, and then covered his mouth as if to stop the sound from growing. Another man whispered a prayer he had not said since childhood. A third counted each shot he fired and thought, 10, 11, 12, and when he lost count, he felt a small fear rise and swallow it, thinking, only the next shot matters. The Zulus sang at intervals, deep and layered. It was not a chant of hate, it was a sound of many voices together, like the ground speaking. The defenders sat with their backs against rough sacks and listened and breathed and waited. And then, after countless small attacks that felt like one long fight, the dark began to pale. The eastern sky turned from black to violet, then to a thin gray. The land changed shape again. The hills came back out of the night. The line of the barricade looked real, not a dream. Faces took on form, not just eyes and teeth. In the half-light, the men saw movement on the high ground. Not a fresh rush, a long, measured withdrawal. Thousands of Zulu warriors moving off, step by step, like a tide turning. The defenders did not cheer. They watched, stunned that they were still alive. They did not know if a last assault would come. They waited until the sun cleared the hills and the air warmed and the flies began to come. Then they stood. They saw the hospital roof black and open to the sky. They saw the yard tumbled with debris. They saw dark shapes in the grass beyond the wall. They saw a wall of mealie bags scuffed and slumped. Biscuits burst from boxes. Cartwheels tilted. A ladle fallen by a bucket where someone had paused to drink and never came back. They saw each other. Faces pale with ash, eyes rimmed red, shirts scorched, hands grimy. They looked taller than before or smaller, depending on how you measured a man after a night like that. Around mid-morning, a column of redcoats appeared. Lord Chelmsford had returned, tired and grave from the shock of Isandlwana. He walked through the station and took in the scene. He saw how the walls had been built. He saw where the line had bent where it had held. He saw the dead. He saw men who had chosen to stay and had made that choice good. 17 defenders were dead, more wounded. The Zulu dead around the post were many. Those carried off were more. Numbers can turn cold, so let us speak names. Dalton, the veteran commissary whose plan for the barricades may have saved them all, would be honored for bravery. Bourne, the young color sergeant whose voice never shook. Surgeon Reynolds, who stood where others ducked and did his work in smoke and flame. Reverend Smith, who carried cartridges like a lifeline. Chard and Bromhead, the 2 lieutenants who shouldered command without fuss and held it. In that hospital, men like Hook, Williams, and Jones fought room by room and dragged patients through fire and broken walls. Many more did brave work without anyone to write it down. A Swiss volunteer, Corporal Christian Scheiss, fought with a broken foot and would not leave the line. Some men held a corner with 3 rifles between them, taking turns to load and fire. Some crawled out under fire to pull a wounded friend by his collar, and were almost dragged back by the weight and still did not let go. The battle had not been won by one act, one shot, one hero. It had been won by minutes linked to minutes, by hands passing ammunition, by men who did small, brave things that built into something large. News of Rorke's drift spread fast. Many people in Britain had only just heard of the loss at Isandlwana when they learned of a stand that sounded almost impossible. Fewer than 160 men holding against thousands through a long afternoon and a long night. Praise followed and pride. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense, the most for any single action in British history. For the Zulu, the fight was part of a larger war that would continue with harsh turns. They had struck a great blow at Isandlwana and had tested Rorke's drift hard. They fought with courage and skill. No one who faced them at the walls would ever call them anything less than brave. What does Rorke's drift mean so many years later? It is not a triumph to wave like a flag for one side or another. It is a record of what people can do when they stand together under pressure. It is also a reminder of the costs of empire and invasion, of how wars begin on paper and end on ground, where wood burns and doctors work by lamplight. At Rorke's drift, duty was not a word. It was a stack of corn sacks built into a wall. Leadership was not a speech. It was a steady hand and a short order at the right time. Faith was not a sermon. It was a chaplain passing cartridges with a set face. Mercy was not an idea. It was a surgeon binding a wound under fire and telling a man to hold on. And courage? Courage was men who could have run, choosing instead to stay and then making that choice again with every minute until the sun came up. Walk the ground today, and it looks quiet. The buildings are painted and clean. The river moves like it always did. You can touch the walls and think of the hands that built them in haste. Hear the scrape of a sack being dragged. Feel the rough weave under your palm. Think of John Chard, who was not there to seek glory, but to build a bridge, and who proved that calm control is a kind of strength. Think of Gonville Bromhead, who could not hear well, yet heard what mattered. The need to be seen by his men, to be present where morale is brittle. Think of Dalton, who could see a map in his head and draw it onto the dirt with bags and boxes. Think of Surgeon Reynolds, who made a safe place where there was none. Think of Hook, Williams, and Jones in those narrow rooms where flame turned air to knives and how they did not abandon the weak. Think of Color Sergeant Bourne's voice cutting through the fear. Think of Corporal Scheiss, far from his first home, fighting like any man for the friend on his left, the friend on his right. And think of the Zulu regiments, men of the Uthulwana, Indlondlo, Indluyengwe, and others, disciplined, tireless, brave, moving with a unity that made their rushes feel like a living thing. Think of the songs in the night not as taunts, but as a way of standing together under their own kind of pressure. Rorke's Drift has been told as legend for a long time. It is easy to polish it until it shines and loses shape. Better to keep the scratches. The defense worked because of small acts that any person can understand. They planned, they built, they kept their heads. They gave each other tasks that mattered. They moved from the big idea, we will stand, to simple actions. Drag that sack, cut that loophole, pass that cartridge, hold this corner. They found leaders in the people they already were. A commissary, a chaplain, a surgeon, a quiet engineer, a hard-of-hearing infantry officer, a young color sergeant, a private who would not let go of a wounded man. They did not wait for perfect heroes to arrive. They made the groundwork for them. From farm supplies, they shaped a line that stretched the enemy out and forced them to come where bullets could do their work. They built an inner redoubt to retreat into if the yard fell. When the hospital burned, they did not give up. They turned from rooms to doorways to holes in walls, one step at a time. They watched the clock without worshiping it. They fought for minutes, not for history, but minute by minute is how history is made. When Chelmsford's men finished their work at the mission, when the dead were counted and the wounded carried, when the last small fires were stamped out, quiet returned. A soldier sat on the box and looked at his hands, and then at the line where he had spent the night. He had never thought much about corn sacks before. He would not forget them now. I guess a letter went home, one of many, telling family and friends that he was safe, or that someone they loved had fallen, or that we did our best. The words were simple, they were enough. Awards were written up, medals were pinned, the world took notice. Time moved on. The Zulu War would have other battles, Lobane, Kambula, Ulundi, and a hard end for the Zulu nation. But Rorke's Drift stayed in the memory. In the long roll of wars, few stands feel both so small and so complete. There are places on Earth where people chose to stand fast and did not break. Rorke's Drift is one. When we speak of it, we should do so with respect for all who bled there on both sides. Because what they showed, beyond flags and uniforms, was the stubborn human will to hold when holding seems impossible. In January 1879, a mission station on the border became a fortress built by tired hands and firm hearts. Fewer than 160 men, soldiers, patients, a chaplain, a surgeon, a commissary, stood in the doorway of a war and would not move. Thousands tried to push them aside. The night burned, the night sang, the night passed. The sun rose on men who had kept their promise to each other. That is Rorke's Drift. Not magic, not myth. Just courage, duty, and the work of minutes that became a day. And then a story that still stands.